So you just type in the sound.
Oh, that's so cool.
Shibuya, Sequoia, Go, yeah.
Beautiful.
But what we want to do today is just talk to you about, your background, your history, cooking for your family, and anything else that you want to tell us specifically about Cherokee food.
My Cherokee name is O'Hurley. And I was already grown before I found out what that meant. And that means dancing around the fire. That's the religious ceremony, the stomp dance. But when you're dancing around that fire, that's what you're doing, O'Hurley.
Talk to us about food a little bit.
Well, I guess I learned to prepare traditional foods when my grandmother was still living. I learned how to, to skin corn for cornmeal, and then some of the desserts, and of course all the traditional foods that we eat. I learned when my grandmother was still living, but of course being around my mother, and it's different. We have a bread we call bean bread. Of course, we have chestnut bread that you wrap in leaves. You either use corn leaves or hickory leaves. And I'm fortunate, we've got hickory trees all around. It's very good to us. But people who didn't grow up eating it may not like it because it's bland. You have to pour grease over it. Of course, you got to have that fat back to make it taste even better.
What's the Cherokee name for that bread?
Tuya de shuyi. It literally means it has beans mixed in it. Or tili de shuyi. It has chestnuts in it. And we even use sweet potatoes, cut them up and put it in the noon uniganasti shuyi. It has sweet potatoes in it. Some people will wrap that bread in aluminum foil. My grandmother would flip over in her grave if she knew I did that.
Can you talk to us about some greens?
Greens?
Cooking green.
Oh yeah, well there's Sous Chef. Grows along damp areas, usually around, like branches. It's called crow's foot.
Is there a Cherokee name for this?
Anatskwalunkski. It means it breaks apart. But it has nothing to do with breaking apart. It has 3 leaves to it. And very strong. You have to boil it and rinse it. Boil it again, rinse it again, and then season it. That grows, along the damp areas like Sous Chef.
So here's what could be called the #1 Cherokee Green. It's certainly the one I hear from my friends about over and over again. And they call it Sochan. And it's related to black-eyed Susie or echinacea, if you know those flowers. And if you taste it, you might wonder why it's their favorite green, because it tastes kind of like a flower. Or maybe parsley. It even looks like a kind of a giant parsley. So if you like parsley, you might like this. But you wouldn't eat it raw like parsley. So a little bit is okay, but you have to cook it. So you get a whole mess of them and cook it up like spinach. And Sochan's the name. And you can see that it's dying back. So the ones I want to pick are the small ones that are coming back in the fall.
Alan has been harvesting some wild Sous Chef greens, so I was going to cook those down sort of wilted style with that, and then probably just to have a little basis of different flavor and texture, some pickled pumpkin, and then maybe some local honey.
I wanted to do everything my grandmother did. I wanted to help her, you know. Sometimes it was a lot of work, and I wish I hadn't volunteered to help, but you know, I learned early on that that's how you learned, was by helping. I grew up when, you know, times were kind of hard. So you help, you know, in the cornfields and in the gardens. And you help gather mushrooms, the vegetables that grew up in the mountains. So you learned how to gather them.
So here's another Cherokee food, kind of mushroom called a bolete. Yes, it's big and floppy and mushy, so I usually dry these and powder it into soup. But if we find a young one, it'll be a bit more firm. All right, so this mushroom will grow with pine trees, and here's the tree. It's not always that obvious. The tree could be 50 yards away, you know, going under a road, and the mushroom will be on the other side, because connected to the roots is the fungus that helps this tree grow, and vice versa. But if the mushroom's not out, then you can always eat the tree. In fact, Yul Gibbons, famous wild foods expert, his famous line was, "Ever eat a pine tree?" And sure enough, you might have had pine nuts, but you may not have known that you could just chew on these leaves. Of course, they're a bit tough and resinous, but we can make some pretty fancy cocktails nowadays with something that's all over the place. So, the supermarket of the woods, I've heard this called.
My grandparents had big cornfields, corn being the main staple of our foods. They raised a lot of green beans, and of course they had fruit trees. I can remember seeing dried apples hanging. They had one room separate from the living quarters where there was pumpkins hanging, drying, peaches, apples, cabbage. She would quarter cabbage, string them up just the same way she did her green beans, and hang them up.
As a way of preserving.
Mm-hmm. And of course they raised hogs. And it's neat how they preserved hog meat. It was cut into little pieces and fried. And then all that meat was put into big crocks. Grease was poured on top of it. Oh, that was so delicious. I'd come home from school in the evenings and I'd get, we call them gunzoon, wooden spoons, and dig in there and get a piece of, you know, cooked pork. And it seems kind of odd, you know, and we ate a lot of pork, but I don't remember anybody complaining of high blood pressure.
Grease, I guess, a dish that, or a way that Myrtle and her family preserved pork, and I'm doing it, you know, I have no idea what it tasted like, what they seasoned it with, but she was talking to us, and it's just something that I find interesting, and kind of the way that other people around the world preserve meat is just kind of comfy and storing it in its fat and without refrigeration. So. And then a bunch of dried things. She was talking about dried apples on the tree, and I really thought that was amazing. And then dried cabbage. Never heard of drying cabbage for preserving it.
Course 2, the
What's your, you have the pork, and then what's the other
I've got a
course?
fried pork dish with some dried cabbage that's fermented in dried apple and dried red greens. Neither one of mine are too heavy because they're going to be pretty small portions and brothy. I don't think either one of mine should be too far down
Yeah.
following bear or venison.
Yeah.
So you probably maybe course 2 would be looking at. Which one you want to choose for?
Or your fish, where do you see that coming in?
I mean, I was gonna say I think fish needs to go, somewhere at the top,
Yeah.
obviously, just because everything else is so
You want to do it next?
game. Yeah, I can go second
Okay.
on that.
What do you got?
So it's Riverstone cooked trout, and then we'll have sumac, slick mushrooms, a little river water broth with some burnt autumn leaves and burnt nutshells. And then I have some moss that I'm trying my damnedest to get clean, but it is not working out well. It is residual dirt like nobody's business. So possibly moss, but other than that, that's really about it. And then I have some hazelnuts that are, some foraged hazelnuts that are fermented in some homemade yogurt.
So the hazelnuts are fermented.
Yep.
What I dreaded the most was my grandmother raised clay peas. And when they dried, it was so hard, having to shell those clay peas. It's hard on the fingers. I dreaded it when it was time. They'd bring in all the dried clay peas in, bushel bags, and we would sit at night. They would talk, tell their stories while we shell those clay peas. But the stories were interesting. They would talk about the old days and, tell myths and legends.
Do you remember any of them?
I remember some.
Is there one you want to tell us for the camera?
I was gonna say, what would, like as a kid, what would have been that favorite story?
My favorite story, I don't mind sharing that with you at all, was about ginseng. The healers. Now, Cherokee, be they men or women, don't like to be called medicine man or medicine woman. That's a Unags way. That's a Unags word. But the healers, but it was the men. They would get together once a year off somewhere in a secluded place, and they would share their knowledge. And they would do this for 4 nights. Well, the first night, they had smoke, passed the pipe around, and they got started. And it was always the eldest down to the youngest that would start talking, sharing their knowledge of medicine. And they had talked, and it got down, and all of a sudden, there's a young man sitting there. They didn't even notice that he had joined their group. And he politely waited, because he was the youngest, till it was his turn. And he spoke. And just amazed the other healers to be so young, but very knowledgeable. Well, when they had completed talking, he was gone. And they're asking each other, who was that? Gosh, he's young, but he's very knowledgeable. Did anybody know him? Nobody knew him. Nobody knew where he was from. So the second night, the same thing happened. So he waited politely to be the last to talk. And when they were finished, he got up and left. Did anybody find out who he was? Where he's from? No. The third night. Well, before he arrived, they said, now tomorrow night, we gotta find out where his people are from, who he is. So they picked the youngest of the elders. Said, now tomorrow night, as soon as he gets through talking, you follow him. So it was planned. So the fourth night, They talked. And as soon as he finished talking, that youngest of the elders got up and followed him. And he went around the mountain towards the north. And he stayed right behind him. And all of a sudden, he just disappeared. He went right to where he last saw him. And there stood a beautiful ginseng. That's why the ginseng is so sacred to us.
The best way to learn is from someone else. I mean, any skill, not just foraging. And if you break that chain, you have what I went through, which is to learn from books, which is the dumbest way to learn. People think I was smart to go to Princeton, but you actually have to be smart not to go to school at all. You know, that's the really smart person. And what I did was I was very good at doing what I was told, which is to learn from books. And you don't have any traditional culture of people foraging who learn that from a book. And when people ask me, can you tell this poisonous one from that one? Are there any books you can use? I tell them, did you use a book to learn cabbage from iceberg lettuce? Did you go to school for that? Did your parents even ever sit you down to do that? So you learn from experience, and that experience comes with your parents, because I had someone tell me, yeah, you know, when I was a kid once, my mom sent me to the store to get iceberg lettuce, and I came back with a cabbage. And I said, well, that proves the rule. Like, your parents, corrected you. So preservation is important in the sense that the only field guide worth having is one with two legs. It's a mentorship model, an apprenticeship model of learning. You can't learn to swim from a book, to, play piano, fix a car. One time I tried to fix my car, like reading the directions in a book. I was changing the spark plugs. Like 3 days later, the car starts like jumping, like there's like a cat, in a bag under the hood. And turns out all the spark plugs were loose. And it's because I read in the book, it said, don't tighten them too tight because you crack the ceramic. Well, what does too tight mean? How am I supposed to know? That's where the chain breaks, that a human being next to me can actually handhold me through it.
I didn't really know what to expect. It's not any style of food I've ever cooked before, and like Elliot said, there's you have nothing to hide behind. You read these recipes and it's salt, fatback, cornmeal, makes a dumpling, and sometimes the dumplings don't have salt because the salt would make them break apart, or so when you get down to that very plain nitty gritty, just basic cooking, and you're so used to being in a restaurant, as Mike said, where you have everything at your disposal, then it's like, all right, well, how am I going to do this and keep the integrity but still kind of apply my style to it? So that's where the sumac came in, and a lot of fermentation, whether it be dry fermentation or, it's a little out there, but we made a sassafras yogurt. Just because the sassafras was foraged, we made the yogurt ourselves. I think it'll work really well. Fermenting nuts and the kind of the runoff of the yogurt and just things like that, just to, like I said, to keep things preserved, because we've been working towards doing this dinner for so long that as things come in, you're like, well, I really want to use this, but we still have a few more weeks before the dinner. What am I going to do with it? So, all right, well, we can pickle it, but they didn't do a lot of that. So, it's like fermentation,
Right.
Just, or like you said, sun, just leaving something in the sun and seeing what it'll do. Leaving it out in a 70-degree kitchen for a week and seeing what happens to it.
Myrtle, do you have anyone that's in the younger generation that is interested in food here within the community and cooking?
Oh, yes. My granddaughter, you saw the picture in there, Tsalagi. Now, she's learned. She knows how to make the breads. She knows how to find mushrooms. But, the sochan, crow's foot, all that she knows. She's the one grandchild that could survive out.
Do you feel like a lot of other families are sort of having that same dynamic happen where people are passing along and the young ones are actually, some of the young ones are interested in continuing that way of
Not
cooking?
that many.
Really?
I know my friend Martha and I are always talking about, oh gosh, those kids that starved to death. It was something, catastrophic happened, If they couldn't get to a hospital or to a grocery store, they'd die or starve to death. But I think my granddaughter, she could make it.
We know that the southeastern Indians were unusual in that they possessed a way of making a living which combined in fairly even proportions the hunting and gathering of wild foods along with the cultivation of domesticated foods. That means they were both hunters and farmers, which is really cool. Obviously their farming was not on a level that we've taken it, mass production of this or that with fertilizers and pesticides and things, and that's where Alan's argument is that it's wrong, and it is wrong indeed,
Right.
But they grew their own vegetables. They had gardens as well as hunted, as well as foraged. They had and that's how they lived off the land.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have been here for so damn long had that not worked for them, and had the colonists and everyone learned those techniques from them, Because it's a matter of fact. The folks that my family that grew up in eastern North Carolina learned hunting and trapping from the Native Americans that were there, the Tuscaroran tribes and the Toisonot tribes and stuff like that. And there's a huge reservation there in eastern Carolina, not too far from Wilson. So I have great grandfathers and great uncles, distant uncles that hunted and trapped their entire all through the generations of the Civil War. I have an uncle that fled the Confederacy from being shot in Maryland, in Hampton's Gap, Maryland, fled and deserted, came back to the Tar River, and lived in the Tar River for 3.5 years in a cave with several other Confederate deserters, and hunted and trapped and fished that river to survive until the war was over. Dorsey Pridgeon was his name, and he did that because of what they learned from the natives.
There was a man that lived down below where my grandma and grandpa lived that used to grind up the corn. That's how he got his cornmeal. He got a little bit of the cornmeal when we take our corn to him. And then they bartered too, because I remember we didn't have cows. And my grandparents, but the people that lived across the river had cows. So my grandma would trade like the clay peas and the hominy and cornmeal that she made in exchange for milk, sweet milk and buttermilk and butter. Oh, that was the life.
Do you have anything that you can share with us, or any words of wisdom for us for that at all when it comes to Cherokee food?
Throw away your measuring spoons. I have measuring spoons, but I only use them when I'm cooking white man's food. When I'm cooking, our traditional foods, a spoon of, a pinch of this, a pinch of that. And see, that looks like, about 2 or 3, teaspoons of baking soda maybe. But I don't use the rest, even for cakes. I don't use the recipe. I taste it. If it tastes right raw, it's going to taste good when it's cooked.